Welcome to the podcast version of Register Radio. Please stay tuned to the end of this program for a lot of extras.
From the National Catholic Register, this is Register Radio, bringing light and clarity to the news and topics that affect your life.
Pope Francis has appointed 4 church leaders to spearhead the plans for his Vatican summit in February on the abuse crisis. Meantime, more gruesome details are emerging about a disgraced Honduran bishop. What does all of this mean for fighting the abuse crisis? We talked to Register Rome correspondent Edward Pentin. And a century after the end of the Great War, World War I, we can look back at this war to end all wars, as it was called, and assess its bitter legacy, with Register contributor Kevin Turley. Hello, I'm Matthew Bunson, the Register senior editor and co-host for Register Radio, going solo this week while my co-host Jeanette DeMello, editor-in-chief of the National Catholic Register, is away on maternity leave. Mother and baby are doing just fine, by the way, and Jeanette sends her thanks for all of the prayers. Well, Pope Francis is pushing ahead with preparations for his February summit on clergy sex abuse, and he took a key step with the appointment of 4 church officials to help him. The new organizing committee includes Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago, Archbishop Charles Scicluna of Malta, Cardinal Oswald Gracias of Bombay or Mumbai, India, and Jesuit Father Hans Zollner, president at the Center for the Protection of Minors at the Pontifical Gregorian University. What are the implications for this new committee for the February meeting, and what does it tell us about Pope Francis's plans for solving the clergy sexual abuse crisis? I'm joined by Register Rome correspondent Edward Pentin. Hello, Edward, and welcome back to the program.
Hi, good to be with you again, Matthew.
So the announcement from Pope Francis took all of us a little bit by surprise. Not so much that he was creating an organizing committee, but who was actually on the committee. I suppose we could say that 2 of the names aren't much of a surprise, and that's Charles Scicluna and Hans Zollner. Who are those 2? And we'll get to the other members in a second. Right,
yes. Well, Archbishop Charles Scicluna has, as many listeners will probably know, he has a good track record of dealing with abuse. He was, under Benedict, he was the point man for dealing with abuse cases, going as far back as Father Maciel of the Legionaries of Christ, and then he dealt with other cases after that. And he was also brought in again by Pope Francis when we had the Chile scandals and the allegations of cover-up, and he was sent to Chile to investigate those. So he has a good record on this, and so his appointment was in many ways expected and not a surprise. And the same with Father Hans Zollner, who's a Jesuit. He's based at the Gregorian University here in Rome, and he also has done much to try to help safeguard minors. He's in charge of this part of the efforts that Benedict put in place of creating a sort of monitoring body for helping prevent abuse in the church against minors, and he's also a member of the Pontifical Commission for Protection of Minors. So those 2 are very much expected and will take a leading role, I think, in preparations for the meeting. So the presence then of Cardinal Oswald Gracias, or Gracious of India, would that be an apparent effort on the part of the Holy Father to make sure that there's this international perspective? I think definitely, Matthew, yes. I think that's another part of his willingness to obviously go, as he says, to the periphery, to those places where the Church doesn't focus perhaps so much, or at least the Vatican hasn't. And on this issue, certainly outside the West, it hasn't been given so much prominence, with the exception of Latin America, I suppose. But certainly that is part of it. And there are question marks about how he's dealt with abuse cases in the past. So that's a bit more controversial, that appointment. But he is close to the Pope. He's a member of the C9 group of cardinals, which is in charge of church reform and curial reform. They're looking into that. And so I think the Pope trusts him, and I think he believes he's competent enough to deal with this and to help, with the preparations for the meeting. Talking about trust, it would appear that Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago is certainly somebody who is very trusted by Pope Francis. He was named by Pope Francis to Chicago as Archbishop. He was made a cardinal by him. He's been used in a number of high-profile events, including some of the most recent synods. And he seems to have been taking sort of the point on many of the discussions at the U.S. bishops' meeting just this last month
on the very topic of clergy sexual abuse. So I suppose his appointment here isn't a huge surprise, but what does it tell us about Pope Francis's view of sort of the American hierarchy?
Yes, well, again, this is very much a trust issue. I think he does see him as being very much of the same mind. I think he's got a sort of track record of helping the Pope in different ways. He's also a member of the Congregation for Bishops, so he's got a key role there in selecting new bishops. But the question marks are raised, though, about him because he hasn't got a track record of dealing with abuse. And others think, well, there are plenty of other, even American cardinals who would be more appropriate, some people think, such as Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who's had a long experience of dealing with these cases, also as head of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, or also Cardinal Daniel Donato, who's head of the American Bishops. Some people think that he would have perhaps been a better fit. But the Pope has chosen Cardinal Cupich, and I think primarily because I think, again, he trusts him, and I think he also has the same mind as the Pope on this issue. He's spoken a lot about clericalism as being a key issue in this and a key concern, and I think that's very much the Pope's view as well. And so I think there's a meeting of minds there, and I think he feels he's in the best position to help prepare this as well.
Well, you've used the very word I was going to go to, and that's clericalism. Cardinal Cupich is on record as stating that much as Pope Francis has said, it rests at the heart of so much of the problem with clergy sexual abuse. But there seems to be a little challenge in actually defining it. What do Vatican officials tell you they see as clericalism?
Well, I think they see it primarily as abuse of power. They see it as certain bishops using the power of the episcopacy to lord it over other people, to suppress them, and to use that power perhaps either in a sexual way or in another way against those under them or who are vulnerable. And I think they see that as a key problem here. But this is debatable, and others, although they may agree with that, they say that another key issue is homosexuality. And I think an article I wrote in September, Matthew, readers may have read it. It was about looking ahead to this meeting, and with four prominent commentators, and all of them were stressing the importance that homosexuality be mentioned at this conference in February. And if it isn't, then they say, well, it's not going to be worth much. It's going to be not taken seriously, because they feel that is a key issue, along with or besides clericalism, which needs to be addressed.
Well, staying with that theme of predatory homosexuality and apparent rampant immorality among some members of the presbyterate, and it would seem also the episcopate, you have a piece out on the Honduran auxiliary bishop, who, of course, Jose Pineda Fasquia, who, as an auxiliary bishop of Tegucigalpa, somebody who was serving directly under one of the most prominent figures in this pontificate, Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga, the cardinal from Honduras. What are we hearing in terms of new details regarding this, and how does it sort of tie into the problem we're having in confronting this crisis?
Yes, well, I think this is another example, Matthew, of what Pope Francis calls clericalism, but also then mixed in with predatory homosexuality, as you say. And I think there is this concern. It's quite clear, I think, from this case that the auxiliary bishop, Bishop Pineda, had a lot of power. He abused that power. He abused it to secure a large government grant, which then disappeared. There's also a string of homosexual allegations and homosexual lovers that he had, and just generally a long story of corruption and mismanagement and misconduct, which I think if you read it, I think it's quite clear that there is a huge abuse of power there, and it's unchecked, and nobody's held accountable. And even when we heard the news in July that the Pope had accepted the resignation of Bishop Pineda, we haven't heard anything about why it happened. We haven't heard any sanctions imposed upon him or any kind of act of reparation from his part. And so I think there's that concern that a lot of bishops are just they're not being held accountable, and it leads those who are weak and particularly susceptible to abuses of power to do that and to abuse the power of the episcopacy and bring it into disrepute. And I think that's a clear case of what we've got here.
Well, in talking about the episcopacy being led into possible disrepute or a breakdown of credibility, Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, the former prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who, of course, was summarily dismissed by Pope Francis just a short time, a few years ago, in terms of not renewing what everyone would assume to be his next term of office, has been speaking out quite a bit over the last weeks, hasn't he? And I think he has some concerns about the state of affairs in the Church. Yes,
he does. And I think in one of these recent interviews, he's spoken about, he's pinpointed actually canon law, which is quite interesting, in which he said there's a disastrous error in the 1983 Code of Canon Law when dealing with priestly offences regarding the Sixth Commandment. And he says that canon, there is a canon that doesn't even mention homosexuality in that respect as an offence anymore. And he says that it contains a less rigorous set of penalties against any abuser priest. So he's pinpointing canon law as one significant reason of why the Church perhaps hasn't handled this as well as it could have. But he also goes into various other issues. And generally speaking, I think he's just he sees what's happened as a kind of as a sort of consequence of a sort of secularism of the Church. And he sees that a sort of worldliness has entered into the Church, and that's why you're getting a laxity of dealing with these cases, and also with the whole homosexual issue. He sees that as the Church falling down there, because there is this sort of falling away of this sort of secularization of the Church and a weakening of moral theology.
Mm-hmm. And why is he speaking out now, very briefly? It seems that he's trying to get a message out there.
Yes, I think he does feel that. I think he sees his position now that he's a former head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I think he feels that he has a role to play in speaking up for the things that he believes in, and I think he's taking that role to heart. I think he gives interviews quite regularly now, and I think he wants to feel. I think he believes that his role now is to speak up. And he sees the problems, and he just wants to air them. And I think he doesn't want to hold back in that regard.
Understood. And Edward, very, very briefly, what are you working on?
Right. Well, I'm working on a similar case of clericalism in Africa. We're trying to get to the bottom of this story, but there does seem to be more problems related to homosexuality and clericalism together.
Very good.
And that seems to be a problem that we'll get out.
Look forward to reading it. Well, Edward, thank you so much, as always, for your time.
Thanks. Good to be with you, Mike.
When we come back, we talk to Register contributor Kevin Turley about World War I and how it is still shaping the modern world. This is Register Radio.
Have you heard who's reading the Register? Why, it's Marcus Groda.
I believe EWTN's National Catholic Register is unique from other newspapers in that it not only is committed to reporting the news from the world and the Church and our faith, but it does so through the lens of the faithfulness of our Catholic Church.
For a 3-month free subscription to the National Catholic Register, go to ncregister.com and click on the 3 months free banner or call 1-800-421-3230.
Let's return to Register Radio on EWTN.
Welcome back. I'm Matthew Bunson, the Register Senior Editor and co-host for Register Radio, going solo again this week while my co-host, Jeanette DeMello, Editor-in-Chief of the National Catholic Register, is away on maternity leave. 100 years ago, World War I came at last to an end. It left millions dead, countries in ruins, and grand imperial dynasties shattered and doomed to extinction. The so-called war to end all wars was also set the stage for the even bloodier conflict of World War II. What were the lessons of World War I, is there a Catholic angle? Well, to talk about all of that, I'm joined by Register contributor Kevin Turley from London. Kevin, hello. Good to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Matthew. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I have to mention the fact that I was just in London, and you and I had the chance to spend a good chunk of a whole day wandering around Catholic London. And first, I want to thank you publicly for what is one of the most interesting tours I've ever had of London, but in particular Catholic London, with so many delightful surprises. But also the extent of your knowledge was both stunning and, for me, endlessly fascinating. So thank you for that. But I also want to ask you what it means to be a Catholic in a city like London.
Well, I mean, London is... you're a frequent visitor to this city, and I'm sure you're aware that London is not a city given to piety, and a city which was never given to piety. So it's a city of extremes, and one of the biblical verses that often comes to mind is where evil abounds, grace abounds greater. And London is a city with a lot of evils in its midst, which you see and which you hear about. But it's also a place where the words, I think it's of Pope Pius XII, come to mind, which is that on every street there's a saint, probably hidden from view. But there's a lot of holy people in this city, and there's a lot of holy places. And the thing which I think we discussed when you were here, Matthew, was how Catholic London was, certainly in the Middle Ages and medieval times. And that still resonates. I mean, we believe in more than just a temporal order. And I feel that the many martyrs, many devout people, persecuted and otherwise, Catholics down through the centuries, they're still with us. They're still with us in the communion of saints that abounds. And so being in London, I relish it because it's a place where the one thing which I'm sure you realize in London is you can't really be complacent. It's a city which keeps challenging you and keeps thrusting itself your way. And what we have to do as Catholics in this city is to be an alter Christus, another Christ, a presence. And sometimes that's just reading or praying on the tube or going to the churches in central London and joining people with adoration while the rest of London doesn't adores a different God. So it's good. It's good. But it's the same the world over. I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, but sometimes it's just seen in a more starker reality in a place like London. But at the end of the day, the battle, as you and I know, is not out, it's in. And I still have to get up in the morning, and I still have to get on with things and all the usual stuff that you would do, whether you were in Arkansas, London, Washington, or Zimbabwe.
Understood. And live the faith, love the faith, and try to evangelize in a city that sometimes really had no interest in being evangelized or in even tolerating Catholics. One of the things that struck me about our walking tour is how we have these sort of the vestiges of English Catholicism prior to the English Reformation, the English Revolt, and how those bones, though, that the holiness and how the Church endures. I'm thinking especially of the presence of the Blackfriars, of so many little locations that are tucked away that we can still celebrate today.
Yeah, I mean, well, you know as well as I, the famous, I think it's the last chapter in The Everlasting Man of Chesterton, where he talks about the faith that can't be killed. It doesn't go away. It keeps degrading and it keeps seemingly being killed off, but it keeps coming back. And even architecturally, in the names, in the places, in the structures, there's still evidence of a Catholic reality. And I mean, one of the more interesting things with the globalization and the European Union in recent years is that the Catholic population has shot up, mainly because of immigration from Eastern European countries, in particular Poland. I was, last Sunday, in fact, I popped in at 2:00 in a church in West London, which is a Polish church. And it was just starting Mass at 2:00, and there was no room in the church. There was no room. I mean, the aisles, everything. I've never seen a church so full outside of a major pilgrimage centre. And this was 2:00. And I looked up and I went outside again and looked at the board, and they had Mass virtually round the clock on a Sunday. Mm-hmm. And if that Mass is anything to go by, and it was full of young people with families and all the rest. So the one thing which I think we were talking about when we were together is that London, and you will know this as a historian, Matthew, people often sort of say London is going to be this and London's going to be that. And in fact, London keeps surprising. And who knows, in the future we may be reading about a Catholic London. Simply because of all the immigration that's come here.
Well, someone who might make that happen, of course, is John Henry Newman. Blessed John Henry Newman. Your reaction briefly to the news that a second miracle has apparently been approved and that he may, in short order, be Saint John Henry Newman.
Well, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
And I'll just to have you go out on a limb here. Once he's canonized, do you expect that there will be a time in the future that he'll be declared a doctor of the Church?
I think that's very likely. I know you've got a personal interest in doctors of the Church, and I think there's a couple of candidates in the 20th century, not least John Paul II. But I think it's just a matter of time. I mean, the one thing with John Henry Newman, which you know as well as I, is that the cult which is necessary for any cause to progress, in his case, was relatively late in starting. That the sort of I would say that intellectually there was the books after the Second World War in France initially, which sort of started to explore the thought, seriously started to explore the thought of John Henry Newman. But the actual cult around praying to John Henry Newman is a relatively recent phenomena, as I've experienced it, certainly in this country. Certainly when Pope Benedict came, that gave it a great impetus. And in fact, only a few weeks ago, I was at this shrine in Birmingham, in the Birmingham Oratory, and the devotion is leaps and bounds. And and I know that sort of public cult is very, very important to propagate a cause. So it's kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more prayers there are said, the more inevitability of canonization, but it doesn't surprise me at all. And I think it's great. I think it's great to have somebody who's a convert, somebody who's an intellectual, and somebody who was very much a man of his times. I mean, he was in the Great Swim of times. He was greatly involved in Catholic education and evangelization, and he was certainly not shy of taking on the powers that be in his day. And I would say if he was around today, he'd probably be writing for the Register, wouldn't you, Matthew?
I would like to think so, very much so. Yeah, I think he would be a dedicated columnist for us.
He might get moved at some point, yes, absolutely.
He might, yes. Well, talking about the Register, you have a piece that was published just a couple of weeks ago, marking actually the November 11th date, which, of course, is a centenary for the ending of World War I, and the title of it was Golgotha, Catholics and the Great War. And that the subhead for it is How Prayer in the Aid of Chaplains was Vital in the Trenches and Devotion was Bolstered on the Home Front, too. We forget the role of Catholics, even in the English Army, in the Great War, don't we?
Yes, I mean, there's been quite a lot of research done recently around this, but the thing about the Great Wars, as it's called, or the First World War, is that it's a war where there was initially a sort of residue of anti-Catholic prejudice in the British establishment, but an awful lot of that disappeared very quickly on a practical level because of the number of Catholic soldiers. You've got to remember Ireland was part of the British Great Britain at that time, and many Irish regiments and many Irish Catholic chaplains, but also many English Catholic chaplains. And what we have is a kind of, I chose the word Golgotha because it comes from a Wilfred Owen poem, where Wilfred Owen, being known to many of your listeners, was a war poet and wrote about the great tragedy of the war and a little bit of sort of, from his point of view, the senselessness of it all. But from our point of view, Golgotha and the crucifixion of our Lord is the beginning of a sort of resurrection, or the resurrection. And, the figures that I've come across for conversions during the First World War, some figures I've seen are as many as 40,000 people converted in the British military personnel through the offices of the good offices of the example of chaplains, many of whom give their lives, but also the men. I know you come from a military background, Matthew, so I don't need to tell you the famous quote about no atheists in foxholes.
Yes.
And the First World War, for all its blood and for all its damage and for all its horrors, good came out of it. And in some ways, maybe it's a metaphor for all our times, that no matter what situation we're in, God is God and he's in charge, and good can come out of evil, which is the essence of Christianity, I guess. But there's some beautiful stories. Just one I'll quickly tell, if I may. It was a French Paris train station, and on the floor of the large hall there were lots and lots of stretchers with injured, and one of the men was shouting for a priest. He said he desperately needed to confess, and the poor nurse trying to look after him thought, well, how am I going to find a priest in all of this? And somebody in another bed said, I'm a priest, take me to him. Mm-hmm. And she was rather hesitant to begin with, because it would have meant lifting him, and he was in great pain anyway, but she did. She got an ambulance man, and they lifted him over, and he heard the man's confession. And then he called the nurse over, because he couldn't actually raise his arm to give the ego te absolvo. So she raised his hand, and he said the prayer over the dying man. And within minutes, the man was dead, who'd confessed. And shortly after, the priest died.
Amazing.
And what the newspaper reported was, and he saw this, was that the nurse and the stretcher bearer dropped to their knees instantly in prayer, because they'd witnessed something very beautiful and very moving.
Oh,
and I think
an amazing story. Thank you so much for that. We're going to have to leave it at that, though. Kevin Turley, thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward to continuing this conversation about this and a lot of other topics.
Thank you, Matthew. It's nice to speak to you.
Well, my thanks to my guest today. It turned out to be something of an all-English version of Register Radio. My thanks again to Kevin Turley and Edward Pentin. Remember, for more news, analysis, and commentary, check out the National Catholic Register online at ncregister.com. Thanks so much for joining me. For Jeanette DeMello and our producer, Jeff Burson, I'm Matthew Bunson. Until next week, take care and God bless. Welcome back to Register Radio here on our podcast edition of our show. And Kevin, I wanted to pick up a couple of threads from you regarding the Catholics in World War I, because this is one of those topics that I think we need to mine. Because you said something to me when we were in England, correlating the losses in World War I with something else that has been happening in modern England that people really don't think about in terms of devastating impact of events. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, 1918, 2018, you've got the anniversary for the war. And in the United Kingdom, there was very much a very public national commemoration of the loss of so many people during the war. And the figure roughly for the loss of the war, First World War, is between 8 and 9 million people. And last year, 2017, we had another anniversary, which was the 50th anniversary of the introduction, well, since the abortion bill was passed in the United Kingdom, the Abortion Act, which came into effect, in fact, in 1968, in I think it was April or May. And since that date, we've had approximately 8 or 9 million deaths as a result of that. And what struck me very strongly was that there is no monument to those deaths. There is no public proclamation about those deaths. There's no flypasts. There's no soldiers marching with their rifles turned. There's no flags at half-mast. It's a silent and very sad slaughter, which continues. And there's something in that we remember very publicly wars, but there's other things that we choose to forget. And I think as well in the month of November, which this is the last day of, there's something about remembering the dead, which is a very Catholic thing. And there's also something about a public amnesia about the results of legislative change.
And what, for you, are some of the lessons for English Catholics, but Catholics in general, from the Great War that took place 100 years ago?
Well, I think, you're a historian, Matthew, and you'll know that one of the problems with the First World War, from a historic point of view and looking back at it, is that it really is the end of a certain era in, I would say, in European history. You could say that the second part was played out in 1939 to 45, but whereas the Second World War, the historic reading of that is that you were countering an ideology that was ravenous and wanted to take over the world. What you had in the First War was simply a kind of clashing of militaristic egos, be they the German, the Prussian Empire, or the British Empire, or the French, or whatever. So it's difficult to sort of sometimes see it other than a senseless struggle. But I think I would go back to the point I made before, which is that whatever the senselessness of the official sending people to their deaths, what it really demonstrates is the heroism when people are confronted with those sorts of situations. And what was interesting to me when I was doing some research on some of the military chaplains who served in the First World War is that sort of heroism didn't start on the boat to France. That heroism had started in their interior lives and in their public ministry as priests or as lay people, even in some cases, prior to going to France. So I guess maybe that war exaggerates in some ways our weakness or indeed our strengths. But the other thing is, I think, again, the quote about foxholes and atheists, I think that war in whatever shape knocks us out of our routine. And you'll know this as well as I do, Matthew, that the greatest danger to the interior life or one's spiritual life is routine, is getting comfortable. And I think the one thing about war is that it doesn't allow you to get comfortable. I don't know. I mean, you must have reflected as well. What would your reaction have been if you were sitting in a trench in Flanders and the whistle was about to go and you're about to go over the top? I mean...
Well, it's one of those I would hope I had the good sense to avoid being in the trench to begin with. But I agree. I think there was that what so many at the time saw as an almost senseless courage, the willingness to go over the top, knowing the absolute pointlessness. We think of the trenches that barely moved for, over 3 years, perhaps a few yards in one direction or the other. And these great offenses that took place to no effect other than the massive casualties they were causing. So one can appreciate the shattering impact of the war at the end of it. But what always struck me especially about the fall of Germany after the war was how Germany itself was essentially untouched in terms of the specific violence of the war, and yet the country fell because of it. France was the main battleground, and of course also on the Eastern Front. But the idea that a country could be so drained financially and spiritually by a war like this, that its dynasty would fall, strikes me as a very powerful lesson for us today.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you will know that many people have sort of speculated about the kind of spirit that was abroad in Prussia and then Germany, and how that's manifested itself later in the late 20s and 30s, and but then it sort of destroys itself. So you're absolutely right. It's 8 or 9 million people is just an absolute chronic waste of human life for something which, the First World War effectively not only destroyed the Prussian Empire and to some extent Germany, but in many ways it destroyed the economy in Europe. Europe was, the Edwardian England were much more prosperous than what happened in the 20s and 30s. And there's also the unwritten story of the psychological impact of the war. We talk now quite openly about people coming back from theatres of war who are severely damaged emotionally and psychologically. Whereas millions of people were involved in the First World War, and none of them had any sort of therapy or counselling or anything, and the impact on family life or such like.
Well, I think too of anyone who's watched Downton Abbey can be impressed by the recreation that was made on the part of the show, of course written I think by a Catholic, on the impact that World War I had also on the families of England, and the long-term impact that also had on British society. That it was a kind of transformational moment, that we had so many heirs to some of the great houses who were lost, so many of the simple, hard-working people of England who suffered so severely that it had to have a cost, and down the road that became clearer and clearer with so many of the social problems that emerged. Would that be a fair thing to say?
I think so. I mean, I suppose the only thing, and you'll know this, that it's very dangerous to read history backwards.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that, it's a different society. I mean, it was a much more ordered society. But what you had, for example, which came out of the First World War, is is not just that it planted the seeds for the Second World War, and I mean Hitler himself was in the First World War, but you also had the Russian Revolution that effectively came about because of the war. You had the revolution in Ireland, in Dublin in 1916, which set Ireland off on a trajectory, and that would not have happened if the First World War had not taken place. And I mean, it's very interesting that there's a rewriting of history that so many Irishmen were actually fighting out at the front, in the Western Front and other theatres of war. And they were horrified that what they saw is just sort of a stab in the back. And these are Catholic Irishmen. So it sort of completely shattered, as you know, it ended many monarchies and set us off on a whole... it culminates in the Second World War. And... I don't know. I mean, war is never a good thing, and I think the First World War, it's slightly mixed emotions. I mean, I think it's good to take what's good from it, which is the personal example of people and the personal heroism of people. But I think overall, it's not a topic which is edifying, because
no,
I don't think there was a great defeat of evil. I mean, I know there was a lot of propaganda that the Prussians were this and that, but they probably had the same propaganda about the British and the French. So. But I agree with you that the effects of it are very. It's very interesting to see how that would have played out. But looking at British history in the 20s and 30s, what you had was more actually the social strife. I mean, as you had across Europe, you had the rise of extremes. As you know, it was the age of extremes. So you had the rise of the far right in Germany and Italy and Spain to some extent, and then you had the left and communism agitation throughout Western Europe as well as in Eastern Europe, and all of that sort of crashes together in the Second World War, and then we have the Cold War and what have you, Europe divided. So it all starts with, I'm afraid, a shot at Sarajevo, the Archduke, and that starts a whole... It just shows you how one person's actions can dictate, how we're all connected,
And one final point that's worth making is Pope Benedict XV, who tried throughout the almost entirety of the war to bring peace, whose peace plan was... to a large degree stolen by Woodrow Wilson, the American president, but had Europe, had the Allies, had the world listen to the wisdom of that particular pope, World War II might never have happened.
I agree.
There's one last lesson for us, I think.
Absolutely, and I think as well the Emperor Charles, who I think is his cause for canonization is going forward, I think he tried as well to broker peace. But you see, ego... and political ego and military ego stopped that. And I think it was mainly from the Allies side, from the British side, and funny enough.
One of those, another great irony. So, well, Kevin, thank you. Go ahead.
I said another what if of history if peace had come.
Indeed. Well, Kevin, great talking with you, as always.
Okay. Thank you very much, Matthew.
God bless.
Thank you.